Good morning, and thank you all for joining us today. And welcome to our second annual Sasakawa USA Security Forum. We're really delighted to have all of you with us. And for today's conference, we're very grateful to have join us what I think is a rather extraordinary group of speakers. These are some of the key policymakers and experts from both US and Japan who are really at the very core of the bilateral relationship and the people who keep it working as well as it does. And of course, we're also very honored to have as our final speaker of the day, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And they're all here, all the speakers are here to discuss the most critical issues in the US-Japan alliance, talking about some of the many changes that have taken place in recent months, past couple of years, and even just as recently as 2 days ago with the issuance of the first new US-Japan defense guidelines in 18 years. Our speakers are also going to talk about some over-the-horizon issues, US and Japan strategy toward China, the ever-dynamic Indo-Pacific region, and a whole host of other topics. And I know the crowd is still filtering in, but I've had a chance to look at our list of registrants, and it really seems that we've attracted some of the best and brightest from Washington, a real who's who of the folks who make the US-Japan relationship sustain it and enhance it on a day-to-day basis. Now today, April 29th, is an important day for us at Sasakawa USA. It marks exactly 1 year since our first annual security forum, but even more importantly, it marks exactly 1 year to the day since Admiral Dennis Blair took over as our chairman and CEO. And you'll be hearing from the Admiral in just a few minutes on the first panel. But let me just say in the course of a very short 12 months, Sasakawa USA, I think, has made some pretty big strides. We've more than tripled the size of our staff. We've launched a whole host of new programs and activities, and we have a whole host of new ones that are on the way, and even more that are still percolating. But with all those changes that have already happened and that are on the way, our mission is one thing that's going to remain the same, and that's to continue to focus on the US-Japan relationship and on the sort of research, analysis, education to improve understanding and cooperation between Japan and the United States. Now, in addition to Admiral Blair's many contributions in remaking Sasakawa USA, we also owe a great debt of gratitude to Junko Chano as well. Chano-san serves both concurrently as Executive Director of Sasakawa Peace Foundation in Japan, as well as President for us at Sasakawa USA. And we're really pleased that she's with us here today, just arrived from Japan a couple days ago. And so, Junko-san, if I could ask you to the stage, the podium is yours.
So thanks, Dan, for kindly introducing me. And good morning, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to make a few remarks in the opening of the second security conference organized by the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. As Dan mentioned, just 1 year ago, I stood at the podium to open our very first security conference. At our first conference, we focused our efforts on anticipating changes the Japanese government set out to make in the context of the US-Japan alliance. The Japanese version of NSC had just started in December of 2013, and the Advisory Council on the Collective Rights to Self-Defense was about to finalize a set of recommendations to the Prime Minister. after a year, we've gathered here again, this time to discuss how the United States and Japan will collaborate based on the strategic changes the Japanese government has made so far. These significant changes owe a great deal to the Japanese leader who, with his vision and determination, has revitalized the Japanese economy and is proactively promoting peace around the world. I feel very much honored and proud to announce that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe will be joining us later this afternoon. Concerning exemplary leadership, I also would like to direct your attention to another individual who demonstrates how an extraordinary leader can bring about immense changes. And of course, I'm referring to Dennis Blair, the chairman and CEO of the Sasaka Peace Foundation USA. At last year's conference, I introduced Dennis Blair to you as the incoming chairman of the Sasaka Peace Foundation USA. A year has passed, and as Dan mentioned, and you'll see, we have made many remarkable changes. The foundation has greatly expanded its scope of work thanks to the many talented experts we have brought on board. Without his leadership, the Sasaka Peace Foundation USA could not have grown to be an organization reliable and remarkable enough to invite Prime Minister Abe to this conference. Joined by two great leaders, one as a host and one as a guest, today's discussion will be dedicated to ways in which the United States and Japan can work together to face the various security-related challenges in the region and around the globe. We start with a discussion on the United States-Japan strategy on China, followed by an examination of the new bilateral defense guidelines the Japanese government has recently finalized. We will then have a discussion on TPP, as well as America's new security strategies in different regions, before ending with a talk by Prime Minister Abe. As we enjoy what these great leaders have brought to the table today, I hope we have a stimulating discussion that will serve as an impetus for the great leaders of tomorrow. Thank you all for being here with us. And now let me introduce Mark Landra, White House correspondent for the New York Times. He is going to moderate the first session on China. So please enjoy the first session. Thank you so much.
Where do you want to sit? Yeah. Okay. Should I introduce you from the podium, do you think? Should I introduce you from the podium, do you think? No, sir. Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. We're fortunate to kick off today with a really terrific high-level panel that features two retired Navy admirals, one from Japan and one from the United States. And as people have pointed out, the timing really couldn't be better with the Prime Minister of Japan in Washington, the Japanese and the United States having signed this new bilateral defense guidelines just a couple of days ago. These two distinguished naval officers are going to speak to us today about one of the looming security flashpoints in the Asia-Pacific, and that is China's increasingly aggressive moves to assert hegemony over the South China Sea by claiming hundreds of islands, reefs, atolls in the South China Sea, usually over the objections of its weaker neighbors. I'll quickly introduce the two gentlemen. Admiral Dennis Blair, as you've heard before, he is retired from the Navy in 2002 after serving as commander of the United States Pacific Command. In that capacity, he was responsible for all American military deployments throughout the Pacific region, an area that encompasses the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea. He was in command in 2001 when a U.S. Navy EP-3 plane collided with a PLA fighter jet in the skies over Hainan Island. So he has firsthand experience of the kinds of tensions that can erupt in that part of the world. After his military career, Admiral Blair was nominated by President Obama as his first Director of National Intelligence. He served in that post until May 2010. On a lighter note, he's the only known naval officer to have attempted to water ski behind his ship, the destroyer USS Cochrane. Most of the accounts of this that I've looked up never really established whether that was a successful or an unsuccessful attempt. Our second speaker today is Vice Admiral Yoji Koda. Admiral Koda was commissioned in 1973 as an ensign in the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force and has held a series of posts, including commander of the destroyer Sawayuki, chief of staff of the Command Fleet Escort Force, and commander-in-chief of the Self-Defense Force. Admiral Koda retired from the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force in August 2008, and since then he's pursued a career as an academic, a writer, and has been a senior fellow at the Asia Center at Harvard University. Admiral Blair will speak first, followed by Admiral Koda.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks for moderating this, this first session. And welcome, everyone. I think it will be a terrific day today. I see out in the audience a lot of people who know more about East Asia security, U.S.-Japan issues than anybody else, and it's an exciting time to be in this field. So thanks for coming, and we're certainly looking forward to hearing from Prime Minister Abe a little bit later. But for the next few minutes, I'd like to talk about the security strategies of the United States, Japan, and China. Now, U.S. security strategy for the economic and political development of East Asia has been remarkably consistent and successful since 1945, 70 years ago. In a strong position at the end of the Pacific War, the United States has maintained a military balance so that no regional aggressor would be emboldened to use force to change political boundaries. Twice the United States, with Japanese support, has gone to war in East Asia over what it considered military aggression on the Korean Peninsula and in Vietnam. We had a weak and mistaken understanding of the internal dynamics. These were in large measure civil wars. However, the United States was basically motivated by a strategy of defeating major power aggression on these occasions through what we considered to be proxies. Now, once the aftershocks of World War II and the end of the colonial period subsided, the United States maintained this security strategy with a large margin of air and maritime superiority. Meanwhile, Japan's strategy for the region has reflected its evolution from the vanquished, disarmed, and powerless nation of 1945 to the strong and prosperous nation that it is today. It provided bases for American forces in the region, active logistic support during the Korean and Vietnam conflicts, and today, while remaining still strongly against the use of force for political gain, it is now developing a new strategy that it calls proactive contribution to peace. East Asia has been a peaceful place from 1975 to the present, and the economic and social progress that it has made have been astounding. And nowhere have the results been more impressive than China. It has grown to the second largest economy in the world, has pulled almost 500 million of its citizens out of poverty. However, China's economic success has also provided the resources for increased military spending. For the last 15 years, it has increased its defense spending by roughly 10% annually and has been sustaining that pace in recent years, even as its GDP growth has slowed. Much of these increased resources has been spent on maritime and air power, both military and civil. With greater power, China has revived long-dormant maritime territorial claims and has raised the political tensions in the region. It's ironic that the American security balance has provided the stable security environment that has enabled the Chinese economic growth that has in turn provided the resources to upset that stable balance. Now, there are specific local balances of force in areas of dispute in East Asia. On the Korean Peninsula, the balance is based on in-place South Korean and American ground forces and air forces, reinforcements available by mobilization and by American redeployment, and the political commitment there is by treaty. For Taiwan, the balance is based on strong Taiwanese ground forces, repaired defenses, powerful American maritime and air reinforcements at the ready, and the political commitment is by legislation, the Taiwan Relations Act. For the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea, the strategy is based on Japanese Coast Guard, maritime, air, and deployable ground forces, supported by American Navy and air reinforcements. The political commitment is by treaty with a public U.S. declaration. Now, China lays claim to Taiwan and the Senkakus. North Korea, an ally of China, to South Korea. However, the combination of the Republic of Korea, Taiwanese, Japanese forces, along with trained, ready, and deployable American forces, makes military aggression so high risk that a potential aggressor has every incentive not to attempt it. Fundamental to the American role in all these local balances is the freedom to operate maritime and air forces freely throughout the international water and airspace of the region. And this becomes very important as we turn to a fourth location within East Asia. And that location is the South China Sea. And it is here that this traditional strategy of establishing local favorable military balances is not working as well. South China Sea islands are not large, populated, and defended, as is Taiwan, or the peninsula, the semi-island, South Korea. They are claimed by several countries, none of which has the advanced and powerful military capability that Japan has committed to defend the Senkakus. While the Philippines is a treaty ally of the United States, the Philippines has never developed the type of combined forces command that South Korea has built with the United States. In fact, in 1992, the Philippines ended its agreement with the United States for the use of Subic Bay Naval Base and Clark Air Base. In this large and important sea, China's persistent campaign is steadily eroding important U.S. and Japanese interests. It's undermining important interests of all seafaring nations, as well as vital territorial and defense interests of Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia. China is pursuing an administrative, civilian, and sub-military strategy, what Japanese observers call a gray zone strategy. It's based on a single old map, the 9-dashed line map that now appears in the frontispiece of every new Chinese passport. And based on this, China claims ownership of the entire South China Sea. It has created a new territorial jurisdiction over the South China Sea called Sancha, with government offices on Woody Island and the Paracels. It has promulgated Chinese fishing and environmental regulations for the entire South China Sea, and on occasion, it enforces them with Coast Guard vessels. Last year, it deployed a drilling rig deep into the waters claimed by Vietnam, escorting it with an armada of fishing and Coast Guard vessels. It is physically enlarging 2 islands in the Spratlys to build a harbor, runway, and storage areas that will support both civil and military ships and aircraft. These islands are claimed by the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam, all of which are hundreds of miles closer to them than is China. According to a careful count done by researchers at the National Defense University, China has initiated over 3/4 of the aggressive actions in the South China Sea in recent years. China backs up this gray zone aggression with steady intimidation and occasional force. Its goals are to gain de facto control of the islands and other land features and to extend its effective jurisdiction over all the waters of the South China Sea. It will then be in a position to enforce its nationalistic interpretation of its rights and to control the access and activity of other nations' naval forces and shipping. China has been quite open about its objectives. It has developed the military concept of a defensive sea barrier extending hundreds of miles from China's coast to what it calls the first island chain. Chinese commentators frequently refer to China's 3 million square kilometers of blue territory. If you do the math, that's the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea. China claims that this huge region of water and the territory of its neighbors is China's natural defensive barrier, within which China has the right to control the access and the activities of other countries' armed forces. It goes further and asserts that under the United States Convention on Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, it has control over the activities of foreign maritime and air forces within its exclusive economic zone, or EEZ. It has taken action to support that assertion. In 2001, its fighter aircraft harassed, and then one of them ran into an American reconnaissance aircraft 70 miles south of Hainan. In 2009, Chinese ships and aircraft used sustained harassment to force the unarmed survey ship USNS Impeccable out of China's EEZ, again, about 75 miles away from China's coast. In 2014, China protested the deployment of the USS George Washington into international waters in the Yellow Sea in response to North Korean provocations. Chinese maritime legal experts know, and I've talked to them, and I know they know, that its interpretation of EEZ rights is not shared by the great majority of UNCLOS signatories. They know that old maps have never been recognized by international maritime law as a valid basis for territorial disputes. Through its gray zone strategy, using administrative declarations, civil enforcement actions, China is trying to build a much more powerful basis for a claim to ownership of the entire South China Sea. Now, American national interests, the interests of all the nations on the shores of the South China Sea, and in fact, the interest of all seafaring nations will be gravely compromised if this gray zone strategy is successful. America's position of influence in East Asia will be gravely undermined if the South China Sea is entirely Chinese territorial seas or part of its exclusive economic zone. The actions of the 4 other Southeast Asian claimant countries have not been enough to slow China down. The Philippines has confronted Chinese Coast Guard and naval forces at places like Scarborough Shoal, but they have been overmatched. Vietnam has swarmed the Chinese drilling rig with Coast Guard and fishing vessels, and China responded with larger numbers. And the American and Chinese response to this threat has also not measured up to the seriousness of the threat. Official spokespersons have stated that the United States does not take a position on the territorial claims themselves, have called for peaceful settlement of disputes, and have stated that we stand for international codes and the rule of law. Invoking international norms and the rule of law has had and will continue to have little effect on China's policies and actions unless there are incentives to follow these norms and rules, along with penalties if China violates them. As far as China is concerned, international norms are set up to protect the interests of dominant military powers like the United States and to protect the wrongful and impudent claims of small countries that have in the past taken territory from what was then a weak China. So long as there are no penalties to its actions in the South China Sea, China will continue to pursue them. China will follow the international norms when it is satisfied with its territory and its security arrangements, and it has not yet reached that point. If current trends continue, there's no reason to believe that China's strategy will fail. It will, in fact, be the dominant island and atoll occupier and regulation enforcer in the South China Sea, and other countries will challenge its interpretations of its rights at their peril. So what should the United States and Japan do about this? First, both countries, joined by other seafaring nations, must make official, strong declarations of the important interests that they have at stake. In making these declarations, we must go far beyond saying that we stand for freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. The Chinese brush aside such statements by saying that they would never interfere with the flow of oil tankers and other commercial shipping through this region, much of which, by the way, is headed for China. We must assert that the 12 miles beyond every coastline, beyond every true island or high seas, where military operations are unconstrained and will continue to be unconstrained. We must go beyond general calls for peaceful settlements and disputes. We must state officially that it is in the American national interest that the ownership of the islands in the South China Sea be decided by multilateral negotiations rather than unilateral claims of control and unilateral military and civil actions. Now, it would make the American position much stronger if we were to ratify UNCLOS. The high seas provisions of the treaty are critical to the situation in the South China Sea, and we are in a much better position to enforce those provisions if we have full membership in the treaty, as opposed to the somewhat awkward space that we now occupy. Second, the interested parties must establish a diplomatic framework for achieving a multilateral settlement of the conflicting claims. The maritime ASEAN nations, most importantly including Indonesia, should initiate a process for a multilateral settlement of all the outstanding claims in the South China Sea. The maritime nations of the world, the United States, Japan, Australia, India, United Kingdom, France, others, should pledge to support the outcome of such a process. China will decline to participate. It will announce that it will not abide by the results of any such process and may perhaps increase its aggressive activities. Nonetheless, the process should proceed in a transparent fashion with advice from the best maritime international legal experts. There will have to be some imaginative provisions in such a settlement. For example, assigning international trusteeship for some islands. For the Spratlys, it will be impossible to draw lines dividing up the more than 100 islands, atolls, and features in that group. Rather, the settlement should assign individual features to specific countries and draw a joint development area around the Spratlys with fair proportions of revenues divided among the claimant countries. China's claims need to be taken into account, even if China is not present to argue its case in meetings and conferences. Once the settlement is agreed, then all the countries in the region and the world should recognize its provisions. Claimant countries should act on the terms of the settlement. They should develop the islands that are assigned to them. They should enforce fishing and environmental regulations in their EEZs. They should authorize hydrocarbon exploitation in their own EEZs and sign joint development agreements to explore and drill for hydrocarbons in joint development areas. China will denounce this settlement and may continue to take its own unilateral actions to attempt to stop the actions of other claimants. That's what it does now. However, with a settlement, instead of being the dominant country initiating development actions, China will be one among a number of countries taking actions. If China takes actions outside of the islands, territorial seas, and EEZs allotted to it, the international community should condemn those Chinese actions and support the legitimate claimant country's capability to take their own actions and to resist China's. The objective of this plan is not to contain China. It is rather for China to respect a fair, multilateral settlement of a complex set of international overlapping claims. Back in 2002, China and all the ASEAN states signed a declaration on the conduct of parties in the South China Sea. A key provision states, parties concerned undertake to resolve their territorial and jurisdictional disputes by peaceful means, without resorting to the threat or use of force, through friendly consultations and negotiations by sovereign states directly concerned in accordance with universally recognized principles of international law, including the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Since that declaration, and contrary to its provisions, China has insisted it will only negotiate individually with each of the 4 claimants. And aside from settling an EEZ line in the northern end of the Tonkin Gulf with Vietnam, it has shown no willingness to reach compromise settlements. So this proposal would return those issues to the realm of diplomacy, where they belong. A settlement would still allocate to China considerable territory, territorial seas, and a large exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea. China would have the right to operate its military, maritime, and air forces on the high seas throughout the region and to pass freely through international straits. This plan does not advocate military confrontation with China. China has generally taken action that falls below the military level, and it is at this level that the other claimant countries and the world's seafaring nations should contest them and support their own claims. Right now, it does not seem that China is set upon military conquest of the Paracels, the Spratlys, and other islands. Chinese military power is generally kept over the horizon. However, it is worth remembering that on 2 occasions, 1974 in the Paracels, 1988 in the Spratlys, China fought naval engagements with Vietnam, sank Vietnamese ships, and took physical control of islands. However, neither China nor the other claimant countries, nor outside seafaring nations, should escalate this competition to the military level. So to conclude, let me return to the basic American and Japanese strategy for the region. It is to create security balances of power in disputed locations in East Asia. These balances make it high risk to undertake either military aggression or sub-military aggression to support disputed claims. And that security strategy also supports a greater goal, that is, for the countries of the region to avoid arms races that cost government resources, to avoid military confrontations that raise national animosities. Instead, governments can concentrate their resources and their energies on the economic development. The results so far have been astounding and of great benefit to all of East Asia, including China, and to the United States. This strategy of establishing security balances that make aggression high risk is still sound, but the growth of Chinese maritime and air power, Chinese expansive maritime territorial claims, and the Chinese actions to enforce their own concept of a defensive maritime zone out to the first island chain, all of these are challenging that strategy in the South China Sea. The concept of security balances must be extended in the South China Sea to include a policy of sub-military balances, including administrative claims, sub-military forces, and civil authorities. The claimant countries there, supported by the United States, Japan, other nations, must develop multilateral policies and maintain the military and sub-military resources to keep that balance intact. This will remove incentives for aggression, foster growth for further prosperity throughout the region. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion and questions.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, great. Would you put my slide? Yeah. I'm Yoji Koda, like Dennis. I spent almost 17 years at sea in my 36 years career. And today, first of all, let me say thank you for Sasagawa and also Mark for babysitting me. And since the Dennis Admiral Blair spoke a lot about the basic policies, today I'm going to focus mainly on the South China Sea. And Dennis and myself worked together. And our personal relationship goes back to 1984 when he had the USS Cochrane, and I was the executive officer of the Japanese destroyer. When he brought his ship to Yokosuka, there was and is a sister ship program. Since his visit to Yokosuka was brief, my ship was assigned as the sister ship. I think he didn't remember. Then Commander Dennis Blair and Lieutenant Commander Yoji Koda, we met together and played baseball at the baseball field at the naval base. And we drank beer together. And at that time, two of us never believed we would be an admiral and would take the best commanding billet of each service, US PACOM and SYNC SDF. For younger people here, you know, if you have many problems, okay, but still get ready because no one knows the future. And that's exactly what happened on us. So that's my brief story about Dennis. And the first, when we say South China Sea, what's the size? How many of you know? Okay. The size is about 9.5 times as large as that of Japan or that of state of Montana. Or another way of saying is overall U.S. territory south of Interstate 40. Okay? That's the size of South China Sea. Big or short, I don't know. Small, I don't know. Okay, next slide, please. And then when now you understand size, then distance, especially for the military planning or strategy, sometimes the geography really means and cares. So from Okinawa to the middle of the South China Sea, it's about 2,800 kilometers or 1,600 nautical miles. And from Singapore, 1,300 or 700 nautical miles. And from Japan to there, about 5 steaming days for the normal fleet, and 3 days to Singapore. So long or short, it depends on the operations. And the key point is, okay, especially for the Americans, please think about where are the U.S. forces from the Hawaii, Guam, west of Hawaii, Guam, to the African coast. Where are they? There are only two places where the U.S. forces are permanently stationed. That's South Korea and Japan. And U.S. forces in South Korea is a custom-made, tailored force against the Kim's dynasty. So U.S. forces stationed in Japan has the flexibility to support U.S. military strategies. And Japan's role under the alliance is to enable U.S. forces to carry out U.S. forces missions, which really support U.S. strategy and national interest. And most of the U.S. national interest meets and matches Japanese national interest. That's why we have been in alliance for almost 70 years. Okay, but this is the geography. Next, please. Okay, and now, as Dennis mentioned, okay, there are several problems. But for me, one key strategic problem or issue is the Chinese reclamation. And this information has been released about 2 years ago, first from Filipino government. Filipino government released the pictures, but at that time, almost no one in the world paid attention. Then, just recently, in mid-February, for example, CSIS released the precise pictures for the latest of the reclamation. But the key point is, in the northern part or parcels, China already established its footprint, surrounded around the Sanya naval base in the Hainan Island and the Udi Island. And to the south, the Spratly Islands. And of course, this is now the current hot spot. China has about 10 small rocks and reefs, but no more than that. And there are 13 larger islands, which are controlled by non-China. 6 by Filipino, 5 by Vietnam, and 1 by Taiwan, and 1 by Malaysia. So Chinese alternative, without taking those 13 islands by military, China preferred to make the reclamation or landfill. And this is becoming the current problems. And another future potential will be the Scarborough Shoal to the east. Next, please. Okay, this is my map. What I call is a geographic, no, the strategic triangle in the South China Sea. This is the location. From Sanya Naval Base in Hainan Island to the Udi Island, that's in the parcels. Okay? And to the south, Fiery Cross Shoals and several others where China has been reclaiming for several years. And please take a look at the location of the Scarborough to the east. Okay. Scarborough, China has been doing nothing today, but still has a great potential for the future. But if, for example, 10 years from now, China finished reclamation in Scarborough Shoal, there will be a strategic triangle. And my point is, from Okinawa to Singapore, there is no US bases, military bases. US had withdrawn from Philippines in 1992, and Vietnam, of course, getting better, but no bases. This will be our key problem for the future in terms of the alliance. Next, please. And this picture is not a picture of the US Trident D5. China is very good at copying the US technologies. This is a Chinese JL-2, submarine-launched missiles. And the range is said to be about 500 to 700 nautical kilometers. And if fired from the Bohai Bay, okay, it only reaches to the Alaska. They were able to kill maybe 1 million of grizzly bears, but very few Americans. Will it be a real deterrence? Perhaps not. This is Chinese another problem. Okay, next, please. So China needs to redeploy its strategic submarine from the area much closer to the US mainland, which covers the range within the JL-2. So, for example, Western Pacific or even the Eastern Pacific, or in the middle of the Indian Ocean. That's the area where China needs to deploy its future SSBMs, which enable China to wield the strategic nuclear deterrent power against the United States. Next, please. And this is the issue. Okay. Before that, in Japan, East China Sea issue has been a great concern of Japanese people. Yes, it is. But for the global security or major powers security, strategic nuclear, or South China Sea has been much more important. In addition to, I do not discuss here today that sea lines of communications or Chinese national defense posture to the south. These are the real values for China. That's the rationale for China, which really wants to take the control over the South China Sea. But one more thing we need to pay attention is the strategic nuclear. Okay? And China would deploy submarine forces to the Hainan Island. Yes, they are doing. And US doesn't like that. Of course, I'm not a US Navy person, so I don't know. But I guess US will send its attack submarine to track the Chinese submarine. Next, please. And when we take depth of the water into account, okay, for China, China needs to deploy its submarine force to the Pacific or the Indian Ocean from Sanya. So these red arrows will be the path to the exit. And US submarine, SSN, will need to ambush and track those Chinese subs. And I put the location of the three areas, Udi Islands in Parcels, Fiery Cross to the south, Spratlys, and Scarboroughs. Okay. This will give, or this would give the Chinese militaries a certain capability to track and kill the US nuclear submarine, which would track the Chinese submarine. And so ASW, anti-submarine force operations, is not the wartime operations. That's the 24/7 basis operations. Even at this moment, China is trying to track USSSN, and US is trying to track Chinese submarine, and we, JMSDF, is trying to track either the Russian or Chinese submarines. This is the nature of the anti-submarine warfare. Okay? So if the Chinese reclamation in South China Sea will be realized, this will certainly be a game changer for the US-Japan strategies. Okay, next please. And what should we do? Okay, Dennis Blair covered everything, so I don't, cover it at all. But important thing is Japan. Okay, protection of sea lines of communications, or security of the region, and these nuclear power games and security of Japan. Asian country, including Japan, needs the presence of the United States forces. And Japan is the only allied nation which really hosts the US forces, which contribute to US strategies. Okay. And Japan should be an enabler of the US strategy and military operations. That's the real meaning of the US-Japan alliance, one of meanings of the US-Japan alliances, and the value of the South China Sea. Next, please. Okay, that's it. Yeah, I thought there is a magnificent JMSDF and US Navy operations pictures, but I think that's gone, so I don't cover. But we are ready. Body will be able to react to anything at any moment. Thank you.
Well, Admiral Koda, thank you for setting the stage for us, and Admiral Blair for giving us a plan for dealing with the situation. I thought I'd start with a couple of questions. We have about 20 minutes, but then I'd quickly want to go out to the audience and invite you to ask questions. So maybe I'd just kick it off with a first question to Admiral Blair. I happened to be in Hanoi in July 2010 at the East Asia Summit meeting where the then Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, declared, I think for the first time, that the United States had an interest in the peaceful resolution of these maritime disputes. And I have a vivid memory of how angry the Chinese foreign minister was. He stalked out of the meeting, came back in, accused the U.S. of barging into what he viewed as a neighborhood bilateral issue, and then said rather threateningly to the smaller countries arrayed around the table that China was a big country and you are smaller countries. Which leads me to ask, what would prevent the Chinese from reacting very badly to the plan you outlined? And you said that the Chinese to date have reacted to this in a sub-military way. What makes you confident that if a multilateral approach that you describe were inaugurated, that the Chinese might in fact escalate their response? And if they did escalate, what would the proper U.S. response be? It strikes me that in all of these issues in the Pacific, the premium has always been on preventing escalation. How do you prevent it in this case?
I think that if you look at the stakes in the South China Sea, they primarily have to do with the economic development of the resources there. Admiral Koda talked about some of the military significance that goes on beneath the water, but the real significance of the South China Sea, I think, has to do with reviving the fisheries to help countries feed themselves. It has to do with exploiting the hydrocarbons, and these simply cannot take place while a military confrontation is going on. No oil company, I don't care if it's CNOOC or Sinopec or Exxon or BP Shell, will invest in the region. The fishing cannot go on. So I think the military escalation of this basically defeats the the ultimate purpose of it. So I think that cooler heads will prevail in Beijing in terms of some general, huge, large-scale escalation. I think what you will see, however, are some fairly clever, and I hand the Chinese, give the Chinese great credit for the cleverness of their approach to date, making a development here, another deployment there, and so on. And I think you will see more of that. And I think we simply need to be, and by we I mean the claimant countries themselves and those who support them, need to be equally clever in the moves that are taken. And this turns into a competition at the sub-military level. And I think that all sides will see that's true. There will be rhetoric. There will be the angry rhetoric that you saw in 2010. There will be more Coast Guard deployments and so on. But it's in neither side's interest to escalate it to military things. And I just don't think we'll see it.
Admiral Kota, a question for you. I was struck in the slides, the point you made several times that there is no American permanent military presence from Okinawa down to Singapore. We've obviously had this very lively debate over the past couple of years in this country about President Obama's pivot to Asia. A couple of weeks ago, the new Defense Secretary, Ashton Carter, gave a speech in which he made a strong pitch for the trade deal, the TPP trade deal that's at the heart of this pivot. And he used he said something rather provocative. He said, passing TPP is as important to me as another aircraft carrier. I wonder whether you, from your perspective as a Japanese former naval officer, would like to see the U.S. do a little more on the military side. The pivot as it has evolved over the past couple of years, it seems to me, has become very much an economically driven pivot. TPP is very much the centerpiece of it. Is there more the U.S. could do militarily? Would the Japanese like to see the U.S. do more militarily as part of the pivot?
Okay, the first, when many people in Japan say the U.S. rebalancing or pivoting, many people think it's only the matter of the security or military, but exactly, that's the overall U.S. strategies. So TPP is one of them. It's very important, but especially answering your question, like the new defense guidelines, just they announced that 2 days ago. That's a kind of the comprehensive, the future course of actions for two militaries. But I think more focus should be placed on the concrete roles, missions between U.S. and Japanese forces. Of course, the one fact is U.S. and Japan both have the budget problems. So the size of the future military will not get better, larger. But at the same time, that's something Japan and U.S. or JSDF and U.S. military will be able to make up. And so in order for Japan to contribute more to the stability of the region, the key thing is, as I mentioned, the larger visible presence of the U.S. forces. So Japan should do more to enable the U.S. larger presence in this region. So in that sense, I think Japan has much larger responsibility and task to do than the U.S. effort. Japan is in support of the U.S. strategy and military in this case. So if Japan will do more to support the U.S. presence, I think that will help the U.S. to develop the more flexible plan to offset or redeploy its forces from, for example, from the Western Pacific to the South China Sea or Indian Ocean, wherever it's necessary. But key thing is how well will Tokyo and Washington, D.C. cooperate and coordinate in terms of the roles and missions. And I think Japan has much larger role, not pushed by Washington, D.C., by Japanese own intent. Yes.
I was struck I guess a year ago or so, when the Chinese imposed this air defense identification zone in the East China Sea, that the United States, and I think the Japanese to some extent did the same thing. They simply said, we won't recognize it. We won't identify ourselves. And the Chinese, and we'll see how the Chinese react. And the Chinese, in the end, didn't react aggressively. And I wonder whether, does that experience hold any lessons for dealing with the Chinese elsewhere? Or was the ADIZ a sort of a unique set of circumstances? To either one of you.
I would think it illustrates both points. It was something that was unique, in that it was something China had thought about and planned for a long time, and they finally did it. I think it was typical in that it was part of this series of administrative declarations and actions to try to lay an administrative legal framework in place to challenge the administrative and legal framework that they feel does not take into account China's interests. So it leaves a lot of provisions lying around that you can pick up and use as you pursue a strategy of increasing your actual control as opposed to your control based on old maps. And so to that extent, I think it's a piece in that process. So again, I think that this is the area in which the United States should contest China's actions that we don't agree with. So should the nations in the region. You know, the American strategy previously had been this two-part strategy of welcoming China economically, diplomatically, working on hotspots, and then having this hedge fist with military capability that says, but if you go too far, well, China's just too big and growing in too many ways for this simple two-part strategy to hold it. There's this whole middle area which does not involve military fighting, but yet it involves China challenging rules that it doesn't think are fair, should apply to it, were made against its interests. And that's the area in which China is operating. I think it's the area in which, if the positions were reversed, we would be operating too. And so we have to come up with a good strategy, which is what I'm trying to propose in this contested middle area, in which you're not going to war, you're not going to, but you're not going to follow the rules. So you have to sort of deal with it in setting up new rules and taking actions that support your rules and so on. And that's where we are. And I don't think we've given that the thought, the consideration, come up with the strategy among us to deal with.
Were you comfortable, final question, were you comfortable with Ashton Carter's line about TPP being as important to him as a new aircraft carrier?
I think we can do both.
I'd like to go out to the audience. Please, when I call on you, do me a favor and identify yourself. There's a gentleman in about the 5th row, you, sir, who have your hand up. Yeah, why don't we start with you?
Thank you very much to the panel. John Hemmings, adjunct fellow and a PhD at LSE. Just wondering to what extent China's slowdown will impact things that are happening now. Will China become more assertive in a search for external, for legitimacy, or will they also be, will we have more economic leverage to act multilaterally on this?
It's been interesting to see. I always thought that China's military spending was related to their GDP growth. So, rich country, big army. Back when military modernization was the 4th of 4 modernizations, is very restricted. But as we've seen in the last 2 years, as Chinese growth has dropped down from double-digit growth, which sort of matched double-digit military growth, down to 7.5%. The 10% military growth has continued. So to a certain extent, there seems to be Chinese thinking that even if they're becoming growing less, they're going to keep their military power growing more, which would imply a continued aggressive strategy. On the other hand, I think the sort of lecturing, hectoring China that we saw in 2010 was demonstrated not to be very effective in doing anything but driving countries to tighten their relationship with the United States. So I think their current strategy is not to speak loud and aggressive diplomatically, but to just do stuff under the scene. And it remains to be seen if they're going to make the resources available to be doing stuff, military continuation, all of the things that Admiral Koda pointed out, civil aggression in the gray zone areas, and keep the rhetoric down. And I think that's what we have to watch.
Yeah, and one more thing is, clearly after the failure of the Chinese, the trial or rigging off the coast of Vietnam in last May, China changed its the foreign policy from more assertive to less visible, smiling diplomacies. But we have to be practical and pragmatic enough to see what the China is doing today. Yes, there is a change of the Chinese diplomatic policy from the assertive to the smiling, but what China has been doing in South China Sea or East China Sea, no changes. Okay. So China has been doing still the reclamation in various islands, and the harassing several other nations. East China Sea, the situation remains the same. So we should take two factors. One is the change of diplomacies, and the other one is no change in what they have been doing last 10 years. And this is something like the chronic diseases. Okay, it's, worsen your health at the invisible place, and when diagnosed, too late. That's it.
The lady here just in the middle, about 10 rows back, yeah.
Thank you so much. Jennifer Lynn from Dartmouth. There are different narratives that one hears about these territorial and island disputes, and one of them is that it's the bunch of rocks narrative. And according to this, these actions are largely symbolic on China's part. China's just after status, and it's a purely political discussion. And what I'm grateful for today is you're bringing in the strategic element, and I wanted to ask you to develop that further, which is, to what extent would control and reclamation, how is that going to affect the Americans' ability to do what they need to do in the region, across what areas? So I already heard Admiral Koda talk about ASW and potentially expanding Chinese nuclear capabilities. Could you just give us kind of a list of points where you're worried about the adverse strategic effects that would come from greater Chinese control here?
Well, I would say that that the happy dream of a Chinese leader would be absolute air and naval superiority out to the first island chain, prior control over the entry and the operations of the naval forces of all other islands. That's kind of the defensive, comfortable China-centric dream that they have, and I think that is sort of what they would like to have, and I think the actions that we have seen, declaratory, some gray zone, a few military, are sort of building to that end. That's completely unacceptable to the countries that live within that first island zone, and it's completely unacceptable to the United States, which believes in high seas access to friends, neighbors, and resources. So they're two, it's different beds, different dreams, and the question is how you work it out. And I think that the skill on both sides is to work it out without it escalating to the military regime, but to work it out by these other methods, which allow each side to reach a certain number of its goals, but not all of them to the exclusion of the other.
Time for maybe one more. This gentleman here in the middle, in about the fourth row.
Thank you. I'm Tsuneo Akaha from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. My dissertation was on law of the sea and Japan's response to it in terms of transformation of the law of the sea in the 1970s and 80s. So I'm very particularly interested Admiral Blair's comment about Chinese selecting rules as they see fit, basically, in terms of their operations in East China Sea and the South China Sea, and perhaps even in the Yellow Sea. What are the prospects of the United States actually joining the UNCLOS? Because there is also the view around the world that the United States also picks and chooses what rules to abide by. Of course, from the US perspective, it's in compliance with pretty much most of the provisions of the law of the sea. But if the United States does become officially and formally a member of the UNCLOS society, if you will, I think the US credibility, both symbolically as substantively, will be much enhanced. And I wonder if under Congress controlled by Republicans and the White House, I don't know who's going to be heading the White House after the presidential elections, but what are the prospects of the United States becoming a signatory to the convention? Thank you.
I mean, I've worked very hard personally on that issue. I agree completely with what you said, that the United States should ratify it, and I, along with several administrations since it was signed, have been completely unsuccessful. And the more we go along on this situation of following the provisions without having ratified it, the more it seems that everything's okay. We can just do this. I think that's a mistake. I agree with you that we should ratify it. I think the chances of the sort of resistance to deep sea mining, global commons, which was sort of an instinctive reaction back in the 1980s when we first decided not to ratify, are simply not real concerns, and we should make another attempt to do it. Every administration has a certain number of issues that it can put its power behind to push. This has not yet risen to the top of any administration's list, and the efforts of those of us in the private sector have just not been adequate. So I don't think they're very good chances.
Just a little different view. Every year I attend or participate in about 5 to 8 Asia maritime security conferences, multinational. And the US position gives 2 points. One is the good weapons for China to attack the US. Every time, almost every time. Even my visit to Beijing, China always attacked the US by the US position of not ratify the UNCLOS. US doesn't ratify the UNCLOS. You have no rights to say anything about the maritime issues. That's Chinese position. But at the same time, in a very realistic, practical world, Asian nation understand the US policy, even though still US, by the main reason in Congress, the US cannot ratify the UNCLOS. But at the same time, ASEAN nations, Asian nations, ASEAN nations, especially the maritime-related people, including the Navy people, they understand the US position. So in the practical world, does it matter? Perhaps no. That's my quick comment. Thank you.
Well, I'm very sorry that I wasn't able to take more questions, but it's a day-long conference, so I hope others of you will be able to get your questions answered later. It's now 10 o'clock, and so to keep on the schedule, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you, Admiral Kota. Thank you, Admiral Blair. And I think it was a very strong start to the day, and I look forward to the rest of it. Thank you so much.